we have a square of fabric that we're going to make bias tape out of. The bias is the diagonal of the fabric. So when you cut the grain straight across, it doesn't have much give or much stretch. But when you stretch it on the bias across the diagonal, see, it has a lot of stretch to it, even in a woven fabric. And so what happens is when you're sewing bias tape around a curve, it'll help hug the curves. So we're going to make a strip of bias tape, a 2-inch strip of bias tape, out of this 10.5 by 10.5 inch square. And we're going to see how much bias tape we can end up with. So to do this, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to draw a line from one corner to the other. Okay, one thing I like to do before I cut this is I like to label my sides. So you want a marking on this side and the opposite side that will match so that you know that those two go together. So we're going to put a little X on this side and a little X on this side. So we know those two are opposite. And then you want to mark these two opposites too. So for those, I think I'm going to just do like 2 little lines. And now we're going to cut along this line that we drew straight across from corner to corner. You can cut that with your rotary cutter. I'm just not on my cutting mat, so I'm just using my scissors. Okay, now we're going to take the 2 edges that have the X on them and we're going to match them up right sides together. So you should end up with something that kind of looks like a flag. You're going to want to allot for your seam allowance on either end, so make sure there's a 1/4 inch end sticking out on both of these sides. And we're going to clip or pin that together. Okay, so we're going to clip these together so that they don't move while we're sewing them, and then we're going to go sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance across this side. All right, after I've sewn my 1/4 inch seam allowance, I took it over to my iron and I pressed this seam open. So now we're going to draw lines across at 2-inch intervals, and you're wanting it to go long ways, not this way. Okay, so we're going to take our ruler and our marking pencil, and I may have to go get a darker color because I have a white pencil on there. I'm going to use this one. This is an air erasing marker, so it'll just disappear eventually. And I'm going to mark lines 2 inches apart all the way across. So once you have that first line measured, then you can line up your ruler with that line and go over 2 inches and draw another line. And I think we can get one more on here. Okay, and set your pen and your ruler aside. And now we're going to fold these in to where our lines are going to meet up and right sides are touching. Okay, so after you've marked your lines, we're going to flip it over and we are going to fold the edges in. And when you fold it in, the lines should line up, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to take this first mark and we're going to move it over to the second mark and match it up and pin or clip it. And you want to make sure that your line is matching up and touching at a 1/4 inch down, because that's where your seam allowance is going to be. So you should have an empty line here. The first line on this edge is matched up with the second line on that edge. And then you're going to match the next line over and pin or clip it and make sure that the line is lined up a 1/4 inch down. And then you'll have an extra line on this edge. So when you sew this seam together, it's a little fiddly. You're going to sew that together and then you're going to press this seam allowance open. Okay, once you've sewn your 1/4 inch seam allowance and pressed that open. See how this line is continuous, and then this one, I didn't get quite lined up, but that's okay. We can fudge it a little bit. That one should be continuous. You're going to take your scissors and start at this first line that is not attached, and you're going to start cutting along that line. And you're going to go slow and make sure you're only cutting through one layer of fabric at a time, and just keep cutting along that line. And your bias tape will magically unroll. Okay, now see, this is the part that was not 2 inches wide. So I'm just going to go ahead and clip along that seam right there and clip that piece off. And we'll just toss that piece. And then what you have is you have 2-inch wide bias tape. So out of that 10.5-inch square, we ended up with out of that 10.5-inch square, we ended up with 40 inches of 2-inch wide bias tape. So I will put a little chart together so that you can kind of calculate out how big your square needs to be to get the appropriate amount of bias tape for your project. Now all you have to do is iron this in half this way. And if you want double fold bias tape, fold the edges in and then fold it in half again, and you'll end up with 1/2 inch wide bias tape. You can also use a bias tape maker.